In my decades within the British Parliament, I have witnessed how swiftly civilized societies can descend into chaos when seductive but destructive ideologies capture the public imagination. The French Revolution was not an overnight catastrophe. It was preceded by warning signs that prudent observers could have detected years earlier. Today, as America faces its own political upheavals, the same patterns emerge with alarming clarity. The question is not whether dangerous movements will arise, but whether citizens possess the wisdom to recognize them before they gain unstoppable momentum. Through my parliamentary experience and careful observation of revolutionary dynamics, I have developed what might be called a diagnostic test, a framework for distinguishing between legitimate political reform and movements that threaten the very foundations of free government. This test has proven remarkably prescient, revealing how seemingly noble causes can mask destructive ambitions, how abstract principles can become weapons against practical wisdom, and how populist rhetoric can disguise contempt for constitutional order. The ability to apply this diagnostic framework may well determine whether America preserves its constitutional heritage or follows France down the path of revolutionary destruction. Chapter 1: The Abstract Principle Trap, When Theory Replaces Experience. The first warning sign of a dangerous political movement is its elevation of abstract principles over historical experience and practical wisdom. In my observations of the French revolutionaries, I noted their fatal attraction to what they called the rights of man, concepts so ethereal and universal that they bore no connection to the actual circumstances, traditions, or needs of French society. These abstractions became intellectual weapons used to demolish centuries of accumulated wisdom without offering workable alternatives. A dangerous movement invariably presents itself as the champion of pure principles, equality, justice, freedom, or democracy, while dismissing the complex institutional arrangements that have actually secured these goods throughout history. They speak as if political society could be reconstructed according to geometric theorems, ignoring the organic development that creates genuine liberty. When I defended the American colonists, I argued from their concrete historical rights as Englishmen, not from abstract theories about universal human nature. Observe how destructive movements characteristically refuse to acknowledge trade-offs or unintended consequences. They promise that adherence to their principles will solve all problems simultaneously: economic inequality, social injustice, political corruption, even human nature itself. This reveals their fundamental misunderstanding of governance, which is fundamentally about managing competing goods and inevitable tensions, not achieving theoretical perfection. The practical test is simple. Does the movement ground its proposals in successful historical precedents, or does it claim to transcend all previous human experience? Does it acknowledge the complexity of implementation, or does it promise simple solutions to complex problems? A movement that dismisses the wisdom of ages in favor of untested theories should be viewed with the deepest suspicion. Experience, not logic, is the proper guide in political affairs. Prudent citizens must ask, are these reformers building upon proven foundations, or are they demolishing tested structures in pursuit of speculative ideals? Chapter 2: The Revolutionary Mindset, Destruction as Progress. The second diagnostic criterion involves the movement's attitude toward existing institutions and traditions. Dangerous movements invariably present destruction as progress, portraying established institutions not as imperfect human creations capable of reform, but as irredeemably corrupt obstacles to human flourishing that must be swept away entirely. During the French Revolution, I witnessed how revolutionaries systematically attacked every pillar of social order: monarchy, church, aristocracy, local traditions, even the calendar itself, claiming that only through complete destruction could genuine progress emerge. This revealed a profound misunderstanding of how human societies actually function. Institutions are not arbitrary impositions upon natural freedom, but organic developments that embody generations of trial, error, and accumulated wisdom about human nature and social cooperation. A movement exhibits dangerous revolutionary characteristics when it refuses to distinguish between reform and revolution, between gradual improvement and systematic destruction. Such movements typically employ rhetoric that portrays all existing arrangements as fundamentally illegitimate, corrupt beyond redemption, and maintained only through force or deception. They promise that once these obstacles are removed, human nature itself will be transformed, creating a new kind of society unprecedented in history. The practical warning signs are unmistakable. Does the movement seek to work within existing constitutional frameworks, or does it treat such frameworks as obstacles to be overcome? Does it respect the gradual processes of democratic persuasion, or does it justify extraordinary measures to achieve its goals? Does it acknowledge the legitimate concerns of those who benefit from current arrangements, or does it demonize all opposition as morally corrupt? Revolutionary movements characteristically display impatience with the slow work of building consensus and changing minds. They view procedural constraints as barriers to justice rather than protections for minority rights and constitutional order. When a movement begins to argue that the urgency of its cause justifies bypassing normal democratic processes, that institutions must be forced to change rather than persuaded, citizens should recognize the revolutionary mindset that preceded France's descent into terror. Chapter 3: The Cult of Popular Will, Demagoguery Disguised as Democracy. The third warning sign appears in how movements understand and relate to popular opinion. Dangerous movements typically claim exclusive representation of the people's will, while simultaneously showing contempt for the actual complexity of public sentiment and the constitutional processes through which legitimate popular governance operates. In my theory of representation, I argued that effective democratic leadership requires representatives who serve not as mere delegates transmitting popular passions, but as trustees exercising informed judgment for the common good. This distinction becomes crucial when evaluating political movements. Legitimate democratic leadership seeks to educate and elevate public discourse, helping citizens understand complex issues and long-term consequences. Dangerous movements, by contrast, systematically inflame popular passions while claiming to simply express the people's authentic voice. The warning signs are clear. Does the movement treat disagreement as evidence of corruption or false consciousness, or does it acknowledge legitimate differences of opinion among reasonable people? Does it engage in serious argument about policy details and trade-offs, or does it rely primarily on emotional appeals and moral condemnation of opponents? Most tellingly, does it respect the constitutional processes that protect minority rights and deliberative decision-making, or does it justify bypassing these constraints in the name of popular mandate? Revolutionary movements characteristically claim that existing institutions suppress the people's true will, which can only be expressed through the movement itself. They present themselves as the authentic voice of popular sovereignty while attacking the complex constitutional arrangements that actually enable democratic governance. This creates a dangerous paradox. The movement claims democratic legitimacy while undermining democratic institutions. I invite you to reflect. When political leaders claim to represent the real America or the true people, while dismissing constitutional constraints and demonizing opponents, are they advancing democratic governance or undermining it? The test is whether the movement strengthens institutions that enable ongoing democratic debate and peaceful transitions of power, or whether it systematically weakens these institutions while claiming greater democratic legitimacy than they provide. Chapter 4: Economic Utopianism, the Fantasy of Costless Transformation. The fourth diagnostic criterion examines the movement's approach to economic policy and its understanding of how prosperity is actually created and sustained. Dangerous movements typically promise economic transformation that violates basic principles of political economy while refusing to acknowledge the cost such changes would impose on society. In my parliamentary experience with colonial taxation and commercial policy, I learned that sound economic governance requires deep respect for the complex web of relationships, incentives, and accumulated capital that sustain prosperity. Revolutionary movements, however, treat the economy as if it were a machine that could be redesigned according to abstract principles of justice or efficiency, ignoring the organic development of commercial relationships and the crucial role of tradition in maintaining economic confidence. The warning signs are characteristic. Does the movement promise to eliminate economic trade-offs through political will alone? Does it treat wealth creation as if it were a simple matter of redistributing existing resources rather than understanding the complex processes through which prosperity is generated? Most dangerously, does it promise that economic transformation will occur without disrupting the social relationships and institutional arrangements that sustain both prosperity and liberty? Revolutionary economic thinking typically displays several fatal flaws. First, it assumes that current economic arrangements exist primarily to benefit the powerful rather than serving broader social functions. Second, it promises that eliminating these arrangements will automatically create superior outcomes without explaining the mechanism by which this will occur. Third, it dismisses concerns about unintended consequences as either evidence of bad faith or failure of imagination. During the French Revolution, I watched as revolutionary economic policies destroyed the complex commercial relationships that sustained French prosperity, creating widespread suffering that the revolutionaries blamed on sabotage and foreign enemies rather than acknowledging the predictable consequences of their own policies. This pattern repeats whenever movements promise economic transformation without respecting the intricate relationships that make commercial society possible. The practical test is straightforward. Does the movement ground its economic proposals in successful historical examples, or does it claim to transcend all previous economic experience? Does it acknowledge the legitimate interests of those who currently contribute to prosperity, or does it treat all existing economic relationships as exploitative? Sound economic policy builds upon proven foundations rather than demolishing tested arrangements in pursuit of theoretical ideals. Chapter 5. The War Against Intermediate Institutions, Destroying Social Bonds. The fifth warning sign involves the movement's attitude toward what we might call intermediate institutions, the churches, communities, professional associations, and voluntary organizations that stand between the individual and the state. Dangerous movements systematically seek to weaken these institutions, either directly through government action or indirectly by transferring their functions to centralized political control. In my understanding of society as an organic whole, these intermediate institutions serve crucial functions that cannot be replaced by political arrangements. They provide identity and belonging that transcend immediate self-interest. They transmit moral wisdom across generations. They offer alternative sources of authority that check political power. And they create the social capital necessary for free government to function effectively. Revolutionary movements view these institutions with suspicion because they represent competing sources of loyalty and alternative visions of human flourishing. Churches provide moral authority independent of political ideology. Communities maintain traditions that resist abstract reconstruction. Professional associations preserve standards and expertise that complicate revolutionary transformation. Voluntary organizations create horizontal relationships that challenge vertical control. The practical warning signs are unmistakable. Does the movement respect the autonomy of religious institutions, or does it seek to subordinate religious authority to political ideology? Does it strengthen local communities and voluntary associations, or does it systematically transfer their functions to centralized political control? Does it acknowledge the legitimate authority of professional expertise and traditional institutions, or does it treat all non-political sources of authority as obstacles to progress? Pay particular attention to how movements handle disagreement from these intermediate institutions. Legitimate political movements engage in good faith debate with religious leaders, community organizations, and professional associations. Dangerous movements systematically attack the legitimacy of these institutions when they resist the movement's agenda, portraying their opposition as evidence of corruption, false consciousness, or reactionary self-interest. Consider this question: when political movements promise to liberate individuals from traditional sources of authority and community belonging, what do they offer in return, and how do they propose to maintain social cohesion without these traditional bonds? The health of free society depends upon maintaining robust intermediate institutions that provide meaning, belonging, and alternative sources of authority. Movements that systematically undermine these institutions, regardless of their stated intentions, threaten the social foundation upon which constitutional government depends. Chapter 6: Imperial Overreach, the Temptation of Universal Solutions. The sixth diagnostic criterion examines whether the movement respects the limits of political action and the diversity of human communities, or whether it seeks to impose uniform solutions across different contexts and cultures. My experience with imperial governance taught me that effective political authority must respect local differences and acknowledge the limits of central control. When I defended the American colonists, I argued that effective imperial governance required accommodation of local traditions, interests, and circumstances rather than imposing uniform policies across diverse communities. The British government's fatal error was assuming that policies appropriate for England could be mechanically applied to America without regard for different historical development, economic conditions, and cultural traditions. Dangerous movements characteristically exhibit what we might call imperial ambition, the desire to extend their principles and policies universally without regard for local variation or the limits of political knowledge. They treat diversity as a problem to be solved rather than a natural condition to be accommodated. This reveals fundamental misunderstanding of both human nature and the proper scope of political authority. The warning signs are clear. Does the movement acknowledge that different communities may legitimately organize themselves differently, or does it insist that its preferred arrangements are universally applicable? Does it respect federalism and local autonomy, or does it seek to centralize decision-making in the name of consistency and efficiency? Does it recognize that political solutions have limits, or does it promise that proper political action can solve all human problems? Revolutionary movements typically display messianic ambition, the belief that their principles, properly applied, will transform not just their own society but potentially all human communities. They view resistance from other cultures or communities not as legitimate difference but as ignorance or moral failure that must be overcome through education, pressure, or force. This imperial mindset appears domestically as well as internationally. Dangerous movements often seek to impose uniform policies across regions with different economic conditions, cultural traditions, and historical experiences. They treat local resistance as backward prejudice rather than legitimate attachment to proven ways of life. The practical test involves examining whether the movement respects the principle of subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be made at the most local level capable of handling them effectively. Does it trust communities to govern themselves within constitutional bounds, or does it systematically transfer authority to higher levels of government in pursuit of universal solutions? Chapter 7: The American Application, Applying Burkean Wisdom to Contemporary Challenges. The final element of our diagnostic framework involves applying these criteria to contemporary American political movements, recognizing both the unique strengths of American constitutional tradition and the particular vulnerabilities of democratic societies to revolutionary appeal. America's constitutional system embodies many principles I have advocated throughout my career: federalism that respects local diversity, separation of powers that prevents concentration of authority, protection of minority rights against majoritarian excess, and procedures that encourage deliberation over immediate passion. These arrangements have proven remarkably durable, surviving civil war, economic depression, and social transformation while preserving essential liberties. However, American democracy faces particular temptations that make Burkean analysis especially relevant. The American commitment to equality and individual rights, while admirable, can be perverted into revolutionary demands for immediate perfection that ignore practical constraints and unintended consequences. The American tradition of innovation and progress can be manipulated to justify destroying tested institutions in pursuit of theoretical improvements. Contemporary American movements should be evaluated using our diagnostic framework. Do they ground their proposals in constitutional precedent and successful historical experience? Or do they claim to transcend all previous American political development? Do they seek to reform existing institutions through constitutional processes? Or do they portray these institutions as fundamentally illegitimate obstacles to justice? Do they respect the complexity of democratic persuasion and coalition building? Or do they justify extraordinary measures to overcome procedural constraints? Pay particular attention to how movements handle America's federal structure and constitutional protections for minority rights. Legitimate American political movements work within federalism, respecting state autonomy and local diversity. They acknowledge that constitutional constraints serve important functions even when they impede immediate policy goals. They build broad coalitions through persuasion rather than attempting to impose solutions through judicial fiat or administrative power. The opportunity before America is to apply conservative prudence to contemporary challenges while preserving the constitutional framework that has secured liberty for over 2 centuries. This requires distinguishing between necessary reforms that strengthen constitutional government and revolutionary changes that would fundamentally alter America's political character. The choice facing Americans parallels choices that have confronted free societies throughout history, whether to preserve liberty through prudent reform within constitutional bounds, or to risk everything in pursuit of theoretical perfection that history suggests will lead to practical tyranny. Conclusion. The diagnostic framework I have outlined, examining movements' relationship to abstract theory versus experience, their attitude toward existing institutions, their understanding of democratic representation, their approach to economic policy, their treatment of intermediate institutions, their respect for diversity and limits, and their relationship to constitutional processes, provides reliable guidance for distinguishing between legitimate political reform and dangerous revolutionary movements. History demonstrates that societies ignore these warning signs at their peril. The French Revolution was not an unpredictable catastrophe but the logical result of embracing principles that any prudent observer could have recognized as destructive. Contemporary Americans possess both the constitutional framework and the historical wisdom necessary to avoid similar disasters, but only if they cultivate the civic virtues necessary to apply this wisdom consistently. The preservation of free government requires citizens capable of distinguishing between prudent reform and revolutionary destruction, between legitimate democratic leadership and demagogic manipulation. This is not merely an intellectual exercise but a practical responsibility upon which the future of American liberty depends. Choose wisely, for the consequences of this choice will echo through generations yet unborn.